All right, resuming recording. Welcome everybody. Welcome back, I should say, for the fourth and final session of our lunch break series on root rots. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. Today we are going to be discussing some lesser known root diseases that you may still encounter as a forest owner in Western Washington. And we have Rachel back for that, but Dan is also on the line. As usual, we'll be having a presentation for about a half hour and then have time for questions after. Please make sure that you set your chat box setting to everybody so we can all see your questions, and feel free to type those away during. And also, the final recording will be uploaded probably sometime next week, because right after this, I'm heading on the road and then taking some time off this weekend. So for those that are looking at the recording, it might take a few days. So sorry about that. Other than that, though, Rachel, we will turn it over to you, give you all the time you need, and then have plenty of time for questions after.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Let me share my screen here.
Oh, sorry. Looks like you're getting that. Okay.
Okay, how's that looking?
Perfect.
Great. So, hi, everyone. Hopefully, with my change of locations, we won't have any technical problems today. Despite that, I am going to turn off my video while talking, just in case, but I'll turn it back on for questions. But I just wanted to say hi before I did that. Okay, so day 4, hooray, you're making it through the week. How do I, give me 1 second here. I'm on a new setup here, and looks like changing the slide is using a different key than I'm used to. Oh, there we go. Not certain what I did, but I'll just click the same thing again. Okay. So you made it to day 4. At this point, you should have a general idea of what roots are, what they might look like in the field, how they go through their typical disease cycle, and then some management options you might have. But today we'll talk about a few more root rots that you may come into as a landowner in Washington. Okay, so we previously talked about laminated root rot, armillaria root rot, and heterobasidian root rot. These are sort of the big 3 you'll see. And the reason why you'll see them a lot is because they are well distributed around Western Washington and even elsewhere. Here are some of the distribution maps from the Forest Service showing where these pathogens may occur. And as you can see, it's pretty much anywhere there are the tree host species. And that's why we focus most of our time on these. We also focus most of our time on these pathogens because they act in a similar manner, and learning about all 3 of them at the same time is easier than doing so separately. However, today we're going to be talking about 3 other root rots that are best taught sort of one at a time. So less concept slides today and more just information about specific diseases. We're going to start with Schweinitzii root or butt rot. Then we're going to move on to black stain root disease, and then end with Port-Orford root rot. So hopefully by the end, you'll be somewhat familiar with all of these, hopefully to a point where they cross your mind and you're able to look up more information online in the future if you do come across them. So starting with Schweinitzii root or butt rot. Schweinitzii root and butt rot is caused by a fungus pathogen, Felis schweinitzii. Schweinitzii is, the scientific name is named after a researcher, and that's how the common name is named, Schweinitzii, which is fun to say, hard to spell. Its main hosts over here are Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, but it can be found in some other conifers. Pretty much any conifer is thought to probably be susceptible at some point. However, that's fairly infrequent in most cases. This root and butt rot is also mainly found in old growth forest or on very old trees, so often trees aging over 150 years old. And you can see, despite this, it's still well distributed throughout our state where trees are found. Schweinitzii root rot is tricky to identify, and that's because its symptoms are rare except in very advanced stages of the disease. What this means is that these trees can look just fine until the roots and that sort of lower portion of the tree called the bud have really rotted out and are at a risk of failing. Despite that, there are scenarios where you may see thinning crowns or poor shoot growth and or branch dieback, but it's not really the main things you can look for in the field. The other thing to note is that despite this being a root rot disease, it's actually not found in well-defined disease pockets. This is something that is scattered throughout a forest stand and not clumped. So different from the other root pathogens we talked about in a very significant way. And you'll realize why this is the case when we talk about the disease cycle. So Schweinitzii root rot does cause rot, as its name indicates. It decays heartwood and roots in the lower 10 feet of the stem of the tree. That's why it's also referred to as butt rot. That's sort of the lower portion of the main stem. Early incipient decay is yellow to red in color. So just like the other root rots, there can be discoloration before advanced decay or that obvious rot follows. In this case, Schweinitzii causes brown rot. So remember, that's a rot that decays, does not decay the lignin. And so you have this sort of structure crumbling, but that dark discoloration remains. And it's brown and cubical in nature. And as you can see in these pictures, this rot, again, occurs mainly in the heartwood. So just a reminder, heartwood is sort of the center most wood of larger tree stems and also in the roots. What this means is this rot is very hard to see in standing trees. And that's because it is sort of hidden by not just the bark, but also the sapwood. So you can get lucky and that your tree may have a wound at its base that sort of gives you a window into the heartwood, but in most cases it's not something you can see easily in standing trees. Now, like we talked about with other root rots, you can expose some roots and look a little closer. Because this disease rots sort of the larger stems that have significant amounts of heartwood, we are looking for some slightly different things when we're looking at the roots. The first thing you might notice is that the roots tend to have these callous skull-like swellings on the root ends, and that's because this disease kills the tips of the roots and sort of leaves these stumps behind. And as you can imagine, that is not nearly as structurally sound for the tree, adding to the risk of failure. And it also impacts the tree's ability to absorb nutrients and water from the ground. At times, looking at some of those smaller roots that you can access from digging around at the ground, you can find sort of a dark red-brown resinosus heartwood. In a healthy tree, this would be cream colored, but you may notice this red-brown residue if you cut into some of the smaller roots if they happen to be nearby some more advanced decay, so something we might come across more easily in the field. Additionally, you may see just in the overall tree some butt swelling, this sort of almost rainforest, traditional jungle style of trees where the base is so much larger than the top. And this can occur, especially in Douglas firs infected with Schweinitzii. Now, this is just a reminder that these are all just the tree's reactions. There are other things that can cause roots to be stumpy-like or swellings at the base of the tree. But if you're seeing these, do consider Schweinitzii. And in fact, the main thing we look for when we are dealing with Schweinitzii in the field is their fruiting structures. These are occasional but distinctive conchs, and you can see some pictures here of a variety of them. These are usually found on sort of horizontal surfaces near either large trees or stumps coming out of the ground, or maybe on top of like a flat stump. They appear in the fall. And they can grow fairly large. They can be up to 10 inches in diameter, maybe even larger at times. They're sort of thick and spongy when new, with a velvety top. And you can see in these pictures here that they can be reddish brown or greenish brown or yellowish brown in color, though they do often have a lighter edge to them. These are also tend to be sort of circular, almost like a plate in shape. And they do have sort of a tapered stem at the bottom that you can't see in these pictures, but we'll see in a picture coming up, that make them mushroom-like, where they have a single stalk coming into this sort of top surface. This fungus by itself, or if you look at any like fungal or mushroom identifying books, it might be referred to as velvet top or Dyer's polypore. So that's just keep in mind that this fruiting structure also has sort of common names of its own. Velvet top because it's sort of fuzzy on top, and Dyer's polypore because there are ways to make dye out of these fruiting bodies. So you'll have to ask someone else how to do that. I have never done that. And oftentimes these fruiting bodies are the main indication that there's decay in a tree, or even the only indication that there might be decay in a tree. So definitely important to keep an eye out. However, if they're not there, it doesn't mean that Schweinitzii is not infecting our tree, because they're not always present, and they do only appear at times during the year to begin with. So these fruiting bodies are annual, means that they don't survive over the course of many years. They're produced once, they release spores, and then they die. In this case, after just a few weeks. After they die, they start to dry out and they darken in color to a brown or a black. They become brittle, and they resemble cow pies quite realistically at times. And that's why you also hear this fruiting body referred to as the cow pie fungus, depending on who you talk to. Despite being dead after just a few weeks, they do persist. So you can find these sort of crumbling brown, dark fruiting bodies around your tree for a few years afterwards. So they do get harder and harder to distinguish from just the soil. Additionally, these fruiting bodies can emerge from a horizontal surface, not quite as common, but you can, I'm sorry, a vertical surface, not quite as common, but something that you may see in the field. In this case, they don't quite have those stalks like mushrooms. Instead, they are more like bracts coming out of the tree in sort of these half disc-like shapes. They go through all the same color changes. They look and feel the same. They just sort of have a slightly different pattern when they grow off of those vertical surfaces. If we turn them over and look on the underside, you'll see sort of larger irregular pores, which hopefully you can see in that left picture. They can also be greenish when they're sort of greenish almost, or lighter when they're first new, but they do turn brown as they age, equivalent to the rest of the fruiting body. Now that bottom center picture is a fruiting body that's been plucked off the ground and turned over, and that's probably the best picture I found showing you that single stalk that most of these growing out of the ground have. So in summary, Schweinitzii is very difficult to detect, and that's why I spent so much time talking about those fruiting bodies, as that's one of the best ways to tell it is there. Unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is the tree falls and then we realize it's infected with Schweinitzii, as that's the time we can see that rot in those roots and at the lower portion of the stem. Additionally, making this identification difficult is that there are other root pathogens or insects that may be involved or attracted to these sort of stressed out trees. And this can mask the Schweinitzii because it certainly is easier to find such things as armillary root rot that we talked about, or say Douglas fir beetle infecting some of these trees before we even consider Schweinitzii. So just to make life more interesting. So a little bit about its life cycle. Those conchs that we talked about, those fruiting bodies, they produce airborne spores when they appear and are fresh in the fall. These airborne spores are widely distributed and deposit on the ground and then eventually percolate into the soil. In this way, they interact with sort of the fine root tips of the tree, so the smallest of the roots and the very tips of those, where they're able to infect the tree itself. Now, this infection can happen on trees of all age. But trees that are young don't really have significant amounts of heartwood, and so therefore there's not much impact to those trees. It's only on these much older trees that have significant amounts of heartwood that Schweinitzii can start to cause impact. Now, root-to-root infection from an infected tree to a neighboring tree is uncommon, and that is what explains the fact that Schweinitzii is found scattered throughout a forest and not clumped together like some of the other root rots we talked about. And then any of material that has significant decay could result in some conchs that's being produced in the fall that sort of complete this life cycle. Now, this pathogen can survive in the stumps and the roots that are rotting for a long period of time. But since root-to-root infection or roots growing into those decaying material is not really a common source of infection, it's not really significant in the disease life cycle, except for the fact that there may be conchs produced from that part of the fungus. So its impact, the main impact is it weakens the tree, and the tree is more likely to break or be blown over in a windstorm. And additionally, it weakens the tree, so it's more susceptible to bark beetles or other root diseases that can quickly kill it and push it over its edge. And then it decays the most valuable part of the tree. So if you do happen to be a timber company interested in timber, that lower portion of the stem of a tree is often the most valuable part of the tree. It's the largest with the most wood. And if there's rot in the center, that really impacts your value of the tree. However, I would say timber companies don't really deal with Schweinitzii because they work on trees that don't get to this age and are infected as much. So they've solved that problem by just having shorter rotations. In reality, this is a disease that causes the most problem in campgrounds or other recreational areas where we have these really large, beautiful trees that people like to come see and camp under. But then those trees may also be at risk of failure, with limited indication that they could be a problem. Management is, there's not tons of management options. Sort of what we've learned with all root diseases, you have to be a little clever and you can only do so many things. The main thing you can do is maintain your tree vigor. Try to be nice to your tree. Don't impact its roots in any way, such as driving over them or digging around the tree. If you are very concerned about Schweinitzii and your trees, you can always shorten your rotation of your forests, meaning get rid of some of those older trees and just keep younger trees on your stand. Again, this is pretty much what timber companies do. Though not specifically for Schweinitzii, they're just trying to increase their timber production. They certainly don't have to deal with this pathogen often. You can consider sort of leaning away some of the more commonly infected tree species and getting your forest towards some more tolerant ones to the disease. You can reference some of those susceptibility charts I pointed you towards to see which ones might be more susceptible and what you might want to get your forest towards. But the main thing is if we have trees showing evidence of Schweinitzii root rot in developed areas, we do want to consider the risk of failure and make some decisions around that. So keep an eye out for those fruiting bodies in places you wouldn't want trees to fail. So that's Schweinitzii. Moving on, we're going to be talking next about black stain root disease, which is a fun one to talk about. This is caused by the fungus Leptographium wagnerii. Today we'll be talking about the variety of the species Pseudotsuga. There is also another variety of this pathogen that is ponderosum, which impacts ponderosa trees on the east side, but today I'll just be focusing on Pseudotsuga that impacts Douglas fir trees on the west side here. As its indicated name, this mainly impacts west side Douglas fir trees that tend to be on the younger side. Often this means that it's newly planted seedlings of Douglas fir or Douglas fir that may be a little bit older, but that have been pruned, which sometimes occurs if people want to decrease the number of knots in this lower portion of their tree stems. This pathogen is also associated with site disturbance, and we'll talk about a little bit of why that is with this disease cycle. The lucky thing here is the above ground symptoms are similar to other root rots. So this is something based on your knowledge from previously in this week, you should be able to recognize that there might be a root rot happening here. You see clustered areas that might have a growth reduction or crown thinning or mortality of trees. And you may also see bark beetles associated with this, just like you would other root diseases. Now, I do want to say that I've been saying this black stain root rot I haven't been saying that. I've been saying black stain root disease, and that's because it's technically not a rot, as it doesn't directly cause decay of the roots, though dead wood will eventually decay by lots of other organisms. This disease is actually a vascular wilt, which is pretty cool and very uncommon on conifer trees. So there are other vascular wilts that impact our hardwoods. What that means is this pathogen sort of clogs the vascular tissues in the tree. Basically, the cells that move water from the ground up to those leaves are clogged, and the tree slowly is killed because of that. So you can see the distribution of this tree on the right. It's more common in Oregon than it is in Washington, but it can show up in scattered times, but it's not something we typically deal a lot with, but maybe something you run across. As the name indicates, black stain root disease is identified mainly by its stain. The stain is darker brown or purplish in color, and it's seen in the sapwood of roots and lower down on the stem of that tree. As you can see in these pictures where the bark has been removed, you can see the staining on that material. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is the stain fades over time. So it is most clearly seen in symptomatic trees or trees that have been recently killed. Once a tree has been dead for a while, this staining fades and is less obvious. So harder to identify what has killed a tree if it has been dead for a long time, if it is black stain root disease. Now, despite seeing the stain, when you peel off the bark, the best way to confirm black stain root disease is present is to look at the cross section and the pattern the stain makes on either the roots or the lower stem of the tree. What you're looking for is staining that occurs in arcs, not in sort of wedges. And we'll look at what a wedge looks like on the next slide. The staining is also just limited to a few growth rings. So you can see it in these pictures where there's some staining, they're arcs, and they're only in certain areas of those tree growth rings. Additionally, this rarely extends radially, and we'll look at some ones that do that on this next slide. So this is not black stain in these pictures. These are other secondary stains, often referred to as blue stains, that only impact deadwood. So this is not a pathogen. This is just a stain that occur on dead trees, though it does impact sometimes what you can do with this wood, as lots of people don't like the blue stain coloration on wood that they buy. Now, what I want you to notice is the differences between this and black stain. You notice that this staining is wedge shaped and it extends radially. So it goes over many years of growth rings. And it isn't limited to just a few. So how does this disease cycle work? Well, black stain root rot does spread locally from root to root contact. That explains why we sort of see those traditional clumping of root decline, root diseases that you see in the field. However, a little uniquely, this also This disease also spreads via long distance by producing fungal spores underneath the bark, so between the wood and the bark, mainly of the roots. These then when there's root feeding insects that are attracted to these roots, such as you might have if you have any disturbance, stressing these trees out with construction or pruning. These insects are attracted, and then they feed on these fungal, or they're feeding on the tree and interacting with the fungal spores, which they can then spread to other trees when they leave the tree and move on to a new tree to feed on. So for example, here is a root feeding bark beetle shown here, just a few millimeters in size, that is thought to spread this pathogen from tree to tree. Oh, here's a reminder picture showing that the local spread is root to root, as you are familiar with. So what can we do about this? Well, we want to favor non-host trees near existing infections. This is not something you really take into management decisions unless you know there's already existing infections on your property or just right next to your property. You also want to minimize soil disturbance or compaction and tree injury. This is always a good thing to do, but in this case, that stress makes those trees more attractant to those insect vectors. And similarly, we want to avoid thinning or pruning between late June and late August, because that's when those insects are most likely to be active and flying between trees. And here are some pictures from Oregon taken offline that I found that showed a site where they had black stain, what it looks like and how they chop into the tree, find indications of staining, and then look at cross sections. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of information about black stain. Not super common, but if you find it, it's good to know that you have it. And then lastly, I'll wrap up quickly with Port-Orford root rot. Patrick, I see I'm getting towards the end of my time, so you don't have to let me know. Port-Orford root rot is a little different than the other root rots because it is the only one that I've talked about so far that is non-native, meaning this pathogen did not co-evolve with its host tree. It was introduced and is now killing these trees in sort of a novel, as a novel interaction. Additionally, it's a water mold. This is like a fungal-like organism. It's actually Oomycetes. If you want to know the scientific term, it behaves a lot like fungi in most terms, so there are some slight differences we'll see in the disease cycle. This pathogen impacts Port-Orford cedars and its cultivars. So if we look at a distribution map of this pathogen, it's mainly in southwestern Oregon because that is where Port-Orford cedars are native to. And so yes, Port-Orford cedar is a little background on this tree. If you're not familiar with it, it is not native to Washington, but it is planted throughout here along with some cultivars in some ornamental settings where it can become a nice, beautiful tree. There are lots of resources online about how to identify different trees between each other because it can certainly appear like some of our native trees, such as our Western red cedar at first glance. I'm going to skip over most of that, but no, there's a lot of good resources out there if you think you might have one of those trees on there and want to learn more about how to identify it. To identify this disease on Port-Orford, you first want to know what tree it's being infected. But once you know you have Port-Orford, you might notice the foliage of these trees discolors and dies, and it's typically on the entire crown. That fades from a green to a yellow to a red and to brown. And if this is a seedling, this happens within weeks when the seedling is infected. And if it's in a mature tree, it might be a few years from between infection and when the tree succumbs to the disease. So you can see pictures here of crown discoloration. Additionally, you want to be aware of the pattern of this discoloration in the landscape because that's a good indication that this might be a root disease. Port-Orford cedar root disease is worse along stream edges and drainages and also along roadways, and we'll see why that is in a second. But here's a picture. You can see a cluster of dying trees right along a roadway. If you see this and you're concerned that it might be Port-Orford cedar root disease, what you want to do is remove some of that lower bark on the tree and try to see if you can see any discoloration there. What you want to look for is this creamy white or healthy wood material and it changing to this deep cinnamon brown where the pathogen has killed the wood. And you can see pictures here, the first two with people pointing, where that cream color has sort of a distinct line going towards that cinnamon brown discoloration that is caused by this Port-Orford cedar root disease. This is a pretty good indication that you have this pathogen here, and that's probably all you need to do to identify it. Though you can sample it and culture it if you feel strongly you need to. It's not something we recommend, but this is just this picture here on the right. This actually isn't Phytophthora lateralis. It's actually a different Phytophthora species. But I thought it was a good visual showing you what we can't see in the field, because this pathogen is microscopic. There's no fruiting bodies or anything we can see with our naked eye. So instead, if you were to deal with it in the lab, you can culture it on Petri dishes as shown in the top part of that image, or look under the microscope at its different structures. And so how this pathogen moves, this microscopic pathogen moves in the field, is typically through local spread with those root-to-root contacts. So just like we learned about with our other root diseases, explaining sort of the clustering of the decline. However, unlike fungi, water molds do produce spores that are able to move within water, that can swim. And that sort of makes the local spread of this not just from root to root, but extends that reach through these swimming spores to trees that may be farther away, especially those that are down, say, a river drainage. Addition to this sort of local spread, we have long distance spread by humans, where we move soil, whether it's dirt on mechanized equipment, dirt on cars, or even the soil in potted plants can harbor this pathogen and then get it close to the trees that you planted and cause an infection. So what can we do about Port-Orford cedar root disease? There are some resistance breeding programs happening by our good friends down in Oregon at the Jarena Genetics Center that we collaborate with, where they're planting different Port-Orford cedars from different sources and seeing if there's any natural resistance in those trees to the pathogen. We also can minimize our movement of soil by cleaning before we move anything. And this is just good practice in general, because there's lots of other things you can be moving in the soil as well. Now, in areas where Port-Orford cedar is native and you have stands of it, you can consider removing sort of the high-risk trees around roadways, or where the soil might be likely to get infected by vehicles, or even farther when you have a stream involved that can move that pathogen. This is not something we really do in Washington, but I think it's a good reminder if you're planting one of those trees, maybe you want to give some space around roadways, or even avoid roadways and where there's a water crossing or a ditch, give it a little extra space where you're planting it. So that summarizes the three other root rots I wanted to cover today. Hopefully they just go in the back of your mind as other possibilities as you're walking around in the field. Now this is not the only root rots and other diseases and things that can impact the roots of your trees, but it's a pretty good start, a place to look at if you're concerned something's happening to your roots in your trees. Now, I've been talking a lot, or Dan has been talking a lot over the last few weeks, and I wanted to just end by some overall comments. There's a lot of things that impact our forests, and I want to remind everyone our goal is resiliency, meaning we want forests that can, in the face of a stressor, still provide us those basic ecosystem services and meet our landowner objectives. And the best way to do this with all these unknowns and different things happening in our world today is to remind yourself of how resilient forest tends to be diverse. And this might be with different tree species present, but it also might be with different age tree species present or different densities of trees present. Just keep in mind that diversity tends to help your forest become more resilient. Additionally, we want to keep in mind tree vigor. The better we can baby our trees, the more likely they can stand these stressors. So just be aware of where their roots are, try not to compress them, and try not to stress them. Also, just a reminder that nothing in a forest is static. If you're hoping you can keep your forest exactly how it is today for the rest of your life, that is not a good objective to have, because you will fail at it. Do remember that trees grow, they need more space, they compete with their neighbors, and our forests changed even within our lifespan pretty dramatically. So please include that into any forest management plans so you don't set yourself up for failure. And then I do want to leave you with a couple of resources if you want to follow up on anything I said or remind yourself in 6 months of something. I will give you these links in the chat once I'm done talking here. These two resources you've already seen. The first is a good place for identification. The second is a good place for discussion on what to do management-wise for a lot of things. We've been talking about root rots, but these also cover a lot of different other insects and diseases that are maybe of interest to you. Additionally, I do want to point out that every year DNR, we put out a forest health highlights report that's available online. Root disease doesn't usually make a big splash in this report because it's something that is part of our forest and has been forever, and it's not changing much in the large scale. However, this will give you sort of an update of what we're seeing in the field that may be new or interesting. And this includes summarizing what we're seeing from the air as well in our aerial survey detection that happens every year. You can look at the raw data, but it's also summarized in this highlights book that is probably the best source of information. Since the survey is sort of a broad scale, what's killing trees from above, and not a local information that's always perfectly accurate to your backyard. Especially of interest that root disease do not get detected well from the air, unfortunately. So they will not show up in the survey much at all. So with that, I'll leave you with my contact information, and I'll get those links put in the chat. And hopefully, Patrick, you've been monitoring the chat if anyone has any questions.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Before we get into the questions, I am going to put a link in the chat for a survey, a very short 5 or 6 question survey on just giving us your feedback and thoughts on this series. And I'll use an urgent word and say I implore you to please, I'll turn my video on too, to please fill that out, because your feedback really means a lot, and helps us understand if these the webinars are having an impact on how you manage your land, and maybe more importantly, provides input on what we'll cover in future series. So there's a question in there. If there's something that you'd like to see covered in the next lunch break series, I do draw from those to pick topics. So next month we'll be doing one similar to this on forest insect pests, and that'll probably be the last one I do of the season until coming back next November or December. This is kind of winter programming for me. But please type away in there whatever you want to hear about, and maybe it'll get covered in one of the next series. So thanks, Rachel. We did get quite a few questions, and Dan answered some of them. So Dan, I think you're probably still online, you feel free to contribute to the answers as well. So Azalea asked, can heavy blackberry litter buildup, in this case decades worth, covering the root flare cause root problems of some sort? So basically heavy organic matter accruing around the root flare of a tree, maybe causing more root diseases. Dan mentioned that if it's associated with saturated soils, that could be the case. If you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also the one thing that brings to mind is when people are mulching, they like to, sometimes we call them volcano trees. They pile up the mulch so much that it's like a volcano with a tree coming out at the top. And we do discourage that because of moisture problems, and also just making an environment where rodents like to go feed on bark underneath there. So I don't know, that seems way more extreme than anything blackberry could do. But if you do have someone mulch your trees that way, or you're concerned, you can always just take a rake and just pull back some of that material until you get to the soil line. No need to move the soil around, but just treat it more like a donut when you're mulching. A little space between the tree bark and the mulch is great. Yeah,
when I was doing urban forestry, we learned that we want a berm, not a volcano. Right. Yeah. So you build up a berm around it, and for gas exchange with the base of the tree. I wonder though, just like a follow-up question, because we talked about this a lot in the last 4 days, or alluded to it a couple different times. How does a saturated soil lead to greater root rot problems? Is it just because it's like a lack of oxygen? It's like an anaerobic environment that causes that, or?
It's kind of funny that if you have a really saturated soil, it can kill roots in a similar manner that drought can, just because there's not enough water.
Sure. Mhm.
So you can't have roots kill themselves. Also, as we saw, especially in like Phytophthora species, they like water to move around. But yeah, I mean, fungi, just like in your fridge, like moist, cool conditions. So that also could be part of it.
That makes sense. So this Laurel has a question in reference to your Dyer's polypore page. Asking if the green leaves in the bottom right picture were intruding the fungal body, or is it just growing up around them? My guess is it was just growing up around them, but maybe.
Yeah. I don't know how to go back. Everything is slightly different on the system.
Not a problem if you can't go back.
Oh, well, man, I can go previous, but that's going to take me forever. Okay,
That'll take you forever. Yeah.
Oh, I do remember that picture though. So Schweinitzii, those fruiting bodies, sometimes fruiting bodies don't grow around vegetation, and other times they sort of just grow through it. And Schweinitzii is one of those things that I have seen it'll just grow through the surrounding veg. I think that was a fern in that picture. But you can see like grass blades through it at times as well.
Oh, that's cool. Let's see. Laura asks, how does pruning trees lead to black stain root disease? And as a follow-up, does that mean you shouldn't prune lower dead branches for fire suppression? And I think Dan answered this somewhere and spoke to the timing of pruning and thinning being critical, but maybe you can speak to that a little more.
Yeah, it's exactly the basically pruning living. So in this case, is pruning living branches. Pruning dead branches aren't going to change the scenario, but let the tree heal over that branch. Pruning living branches, to us, we don't smell anything or attract to them, but to insects at certain times of the year, they find that really attractive. It's like a wound that they can take advantage of and maybe get access into trees, because a healthy, vigorous tree has bark, it has sap. It's really hard for these insects to make their way into the tree itself. But in areas of wounding, those insects are attracted to those trees. So if we're pruning when these insect vectors are flying, it's just more likely that they might end up at our trees. Again, black stain isn't really a huge deal in this area, but yeah, that explains it. And I wouldn't worry anything about dead branches. Prune those.
Yep. So Joan asks, does driving an ATV affect the roots and contribute to root rot? Which I think you kind of touched on.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's hard to completely know what's happening underground. Certainly driving large equipment over large percentages of a tree's root area will have impacts to the tree. If you're just driving a single ATV through a forest once, probably I wouldn't be too worried, unless you're like dealing with, little tiny seedlings and you're somehow getting the entire seedling root covered. Maybe if it was a well-worn path that was circling a tree and taking over most of the tree's root area, that could be a concern. But I think if you're just driving in one area with an ATV, it's not the worst thing.
Yeah, I can agree with that from experience.
Cool.
So Laurel asks, black stain shows in Lewis County, but not in Grays or Pacific. I'm at the corner of the three, so am I free from black stain? And Dan reported not yet. The emphasis on the yet.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's sort of a rough survey too. It just depends on us reporting it in the field, and county boundaries are sort of a rough gradient. But I could imagine it coming there. It would be fun to find, but I wouldn't, out of everything, it wouldn't bother me.
So Joan asked, should one remove conchs? Let's say you had Schweinitzii.
Yeah.
I guess one of the questions is, would removing the conch do anything? And then she also asked, are there good conchs?
Okay. Those are two really important questions, and I'm sorry I didn't mention them. None of this management involves removing conchs, and that's because we sort of assume that these are native pathogens and that their spores are present regardless of where we are. It's more how's the environment in terms of the trees present for them to be infected. So removing a single conch, you're not going to catch it right away. There's other conchs you won't find. There's just, these are windblown spores that can travel quite a distance. So feel free to look at the conchs closely and pick them up, but you're not going to impact the spore load or the possibility of the pathogens there. So yeah, good question. I should have mentioned that. And then, yes, there are lots of different fungal species out there that produce fun and weird looking and cool conchs. Some of them cause disease on our forest trees, and other ones just like dead wood and feed on dead wood and are only there because our forests are full of dead wood. So huge diversity out there. A small percentage are pathogens, and what I usually do is if the conch is on a living tree is when I get a little bit more interested, or if it's one that I already know of. So, but in the most cases, no, there's lots of cool things out there to look at.
And you could argue that even one on a living tree, depending on your objectives, could be a good conch. You could consider Schweinitzii a good conch if you're looking to produce more down dead wood in your forest eventually, which we know dead wood is really good for wildlife habitat.
That's true. If you're asking a pathologist if there's any bad conch, they'll probably say no. They're all interesting.
Yeah. So Laura asked, does the insect spread mean that thinning trees can lead to infection? And Dan took a stab at this. He said if disease is prevalent, he would recommend against thinning. So if you have strong evidence that it's there, otherwise thinning between June and September is recommended.
Yeah.
Okay.
Agree with that.
And the reason for that is that's when the insects, the vectors are not flying.
Yeah, and I would only consider black stain if you have indication that it's there, which is uncommon in Washington. So keep it in the back of your mind, but I wouldn't make any management decisions specifically for it unless you know you have it on your property.
Yeah, and I would wager to guess in most situations, landowners that are thinking about thinning, aside from situations where they do have a really strong presence of some of these issues we're talking about, thinning is probably the right move because it does increase tree vigor long term. So I don't want to discourage anyone from thinning, but definitely we pointed out some really good scenarios where maybe it's not the best move.
Or you just time it slightly differently.
Yeah, exactly. So Joan asked, how do we access the recordings? Joan, I'll point you to the emails I've been sending you each morning. There is a link in there where you can go and view those. And then there's a follow-up question from someone else on how long the recordings and transcripts will be available on that site. And that is indefinite. I don't have any plans to take that website down. So until the end of time, I guess we could say, or until the internet is over. I don't know when that will be. Julian asked, do you have any experience with Felinus conchs on the trunks of Doug fir? We tend to state that conchs on the trunk indicate extensive heart rot and high likelihood of failure.
Okay, so Felinus or laminated root rot doesn't produce conchs. Well, I mean, if you want to call them conchs, that's fine. They produce that like crusty.
I think she's referring to Schweinitzii.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thanks. Can you read that question again then? And I'll think about it in terms of Schweinitzii.
Do you have any experience with Schweinitzii conchs, specifically on the trunks of Doug fir? We tend to state that conchs on the trunk indicate extensive heart rot and high likelihood of failure.
Yeah, I mean, once you see a conch of Schweinitzii, whether it's right next to the tree on the ground or on the tree itself, you should definitely consider its risk of failing is increasing. So yeah, definitely a red flag.
So Carol asked, can mountain bikes on dirt paths and park forests cause enough compaction to negatively affect or kill a tree? I think we can report back to Rachel's earlier answer on
you're
ATVs. Yeah, you're more than likely very fine. Yesterday, Dan said that exposing affected roots causes pathogen to die quickly. How many years is quickly, or how quickly is that?
So there's not one answer to that because it probably depends on the extent that the tree's infected and the size of the tree. But fungi like moist wood, that's cool. So if you get the sun beating down on it, if you are like reaching into a tree and it's like super dry and crumbly, that might be the point where there's not much pathogen left. Regardless, you're getting it out of the ground. So there's less of it in the ground for roots to infect. So it might not actually matter how long it stays in that part of the tree, since it's not in a place where roots interact with it.
John asks, is there a way to submit photos for help with confirming root pathogen?
I mean, you can always send them to me, though oftentimes I'll tell you I can't tell on a photo. If you have a decent amount of property and you're worried, you can always get a service forester out. I sent that link earlier this week. I don't know. I don't have it on hand. If Patrick, you have it on hand.
Yeah, I just put it in, and someone else also pointed out to any landowners listening in, the DNR has a landowner assistance portal where you can get connected with a service forester who can come out, do a site visit, and they can look at a root rot. They're not all forest pathologists, but they have experience in identifying root rots for sure, and certainly can confer with Rachel if they're not sure. Either way, you'll be taken care of, and it's a great program. Definitely worth getting a free site visit out of it.
Yes, great plan. You should do that.
So Simon says, hi Rachel, are there any prevalent root diseases in Washington affecting English oak or European beech? So anything in the ACA family. He says, I've noticed some mature specimens locally in Tacoma that have failed or have fruiting bodies on the butt. They are sometimes in parks near roads. So I wonder if root compaction is the problem rather than a pathogen.
Well, I'm sure root compaction is a problem, whether there's a root pathogen there or not. Armillaria species as a whole do have a wide range of host tree species, including hardwoods, that they can impact. So the species that impact conifers aren't the ones that also impact hardwoods. So there could be something like that, but I suspect it's more root compaction, and any conchs you're seeing might just be decay pathogens taking advantage of that dead wood of trees that are just stressed out.
Yeah. So we got another one here. Is there a wound dressing that would prevent insect damage when pruning? So something, if you were to prune in the vector season, to kind of put on those and prevent.
Yeah, there's been lots of those type of things thrown out throughout the years as possibilities. But I would say don't apply anything to any tree wounds. You want to keep them clear of things. It's just a good reminder that humans, we heal, so we replace ourselves, but trees, they seal. So we just want to keep the wound open and clear. And those trees, over the course of numerous years, depending on how large the wound is, whether it's just a small branch you've pruned off or something like that, will actually slowly callus over those. And that's what you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a bunch of products out there you could look into, but I know that some of them they found to actually do more harm than good and prevent healing. So I agree completely. And the more important thing is just to prune during the right season.
Yeah, and prune properly. So take a few minutes to learn how to prune properly, and then the tree will be able to quickly heal over that wound. And if you do that in the right season, you're golden.
So let's see. Judy asks, can we share the link to the webinar to other people not signed up for them? Yeah, absolutely, Judy. By all means, everyone is more than welcome to share these links with anyone that they would think is interested. Okay, got a couple more comments, including one from Holly Haley, including with more information on DNR service foresters. And programs from the Small Forest Landowner Office. Hi, Holly. Let's see. All right, lots of good questions and good comments, but I think that's the end of it. So I will call it a wrap there and profusely thank Rachel and Dan for helping me put the series on this week. It's really great, and I hope everybody learned a lot. If you have any other final thoughts before we close it off?
Thank you all, and just remember there's lots more going on than just root rots. So I hope you see the root rots that are present, but don't see root rots everywhere, because
Yeah,
they're not everything that's killing trees. And the more you learn about the forest, the more interesting it is to walk around. So have fun. Stay in touch.
agreed. Yeah, absolutely. And before you jump to conclusions, again, I'll reiterate, it's always good to ask for help and support, and those resources are out there, the ones we talked about, particularly through the DNR. Conservation districts also available for help. So, all right, well, with that, then I will close things out, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great weekend after tomorrow.
Great. Thank you, everyone.